Thank you so much, Christina. And can you see my presentation?
Yes, I do.
Audio is good. Sound is good. Audio is good.
Yes, yes.
Great.
Yes.
Excellent. And I also thank my peers working on all the PR for pointing out that we need to use the right logos. I had the last minute effort to insert the right logo here. Thank you for pointing that out. No, thank you so much for having me for the next several minutes in presenting a few insights on what it requires to build a smart territory framework. And for those of you that don't know me, and then that probably is reciprocal, for those of you that I have not gotten introduced to yet, as you may hear from my accent, I'm not Italian. I'm actually from the Netherlands, but I'm one of the board members and founders of the Smart City Association Italy, and a relationship going back a very long time with Rafael Guerrero, who will be joining us later on, as Christina just pointed out. I'm also together with Sai, the author of the Smart Territory Framework Roadmap document, which was delivered on by late March. I was not in a position to present on it per that session late March, for which I apologize. And Guido was so kind to actually take the honors for that. But that document is available, and the point of this presentation is not to actually repeat all the stuff that's written in that document, but actually to, on the one hand, really start at the very beginning. Smart cities, what is it that we're talking about? But take it very quickly, because there's a lot of people still debating that term and what it actually does in this space and whether we should actually be covering it as part of eSmart. And then move on very, very quickly as to what are some of the components, the design principles, the items that we should actually be focusing on as part of eSmart. And hopefully I'll be able to build a good bridge for Rafael and his presentation, which will be much more focused on data strategies and how the city of Rome has adopted those. So with that, I will just get started. Smart cities, I actually personally really dislike the term smart city. I always need to point it out with anyone that starts a debate because it's unclear as to what smart is in some ways. And to the point raised early in the discussion today, digitalization for communities is not just for cities. If that were to be the case, we'd be creating a new digital divide. So it's pointless to do that. It's really about smart communities, but smart cities is a term that was created by marketing departments, by tech companies, and up to a point adopted by many, many, many cities around the world. And it did get a number of definitions, but there is not one definition. And I need to point it out. There's a whole lot of definitions, and it's without going into great detail, it's actually a good point to just pause at this for a second or two and actually see the different type of definitions that are out there. If I take this particular definition, and it comes from our friends in America, what you find is that this is actually really focused about technology, technologies that are embedded across all cities' functions, and then it generates a lot of efficiencies. I need to point out it's somewhat of an American way of defining a smart city. If you take a more European perspective as provided by Eurocities, you already see that it's much more holistic. It's about quality of life, it's about sustainability. And moving fast forward, my own city, Amsterdam, has really, really gone all the way in saying this should not be about technology. Technology is really a means, it should never be an end. And actually, very often, it's not even about digital technology at all. I take this quote from the mayor of Genoa, who once stated, smart city efforts are great, but if the best and most affordable solution that I need for my city happens to be analog, then that's fine. That can happen perfectly well. So, with that in mind, understanding that there is not one definition for a smart city, I started out with building one for a smart territory, which actually has a lot of additional complications in it because it's not about one community, it's not about one jurisdiction, it's not about one set of laws or a regulatory framework. We're dealing with many countries, many cities, different care abouts, different challenges, different expectations how eSmart will deliver for their community's challenges. So with that in mind, a smart territory definition always has to be somewhat broader in perspective than just a smart community or for one smart city. What I think is important here is that what this what the definition of a smart territory should contain is that for no matter how much there is diversity among the different communities and jurisdictions, that what we can collectively agree to is to set the terms and conditions for the territory's mobility and energy futures. That's a very important one for a smart territory definition within the context of eSmart. Um, we may agree to very particular solutions down the road, which is great. But first of all, can we agree to a framework? Can we agree to conditions? Can we agree to methodologies? Can we agree to platforms? Can we agree to data strategies? Can we agree to rules that set the terms on proprietary products and so on, and how we want to work with those? That allows us for a common set of, again, rules and conditions that will allow for solutions and strategies that are interoperable across the Alpine region. So I think this is a very important component to any definition that applies to this particular program, the Smart Territory in place. Why do we need a smart territory in the first place? You can actually debate as to how much do we actually need it. If you think of eSmart as a program that's really focused on mobility, and if you consider eSmart to be focused on smart energy grids and the convergence of those, then why do we really need the smart city type of thinking in there? And it's a good question. First of all, there is going to be a very, very large need of driving a convergence of different vendors. If you think of last mile mobility challenges, for instance, it's unlikely that they will be addressed by one organization in one community, let alone across the entire smart territory. What you will need is a multimodal approach with many different vendors, many different transport companies that will have an agreement as to how they will share data. They will need a data platform. If you do not have that, you do not have the engine for eSmart, if you will. So there is this digital interface that is going to be crucial. The same applies no less to smart energy grids. If you think of smart energy grids and how they get applied to smart mobility, this relies already, but it will rely a lot more in the future on smart payment systems, things to things transactions, and digital security systems. These are components that you need to have in place. And what is important about this is that this all sounds very expensive and it all sounds very, very, very fancy. Very often, a lot of these components are already in place, whether it's on a public side or whether it's on a private side or whether this can be forged through a public-private partnership. But very often, a lot of the assets that you need are already in place. It does need coordination. It does need a shared understanding as to what it takes to have these platforms in place. And I hope my screen isn't freezing. Oh, there we go. There we go. So again, here's a nice little cartoon. We can come up with really, really great last mile freight solutions with great electric vehicles running that. But at the moment you need to connect different vendors coming together, you need to have that unified interoperable interface, as already just pointed out. You also need to make sure that you're able to work very different systems in your approach, different information systems, different types of data coming together, which needs to be normalized. If you think of smart energy grids, what we really need to do is to stop thinking in silos, and we need to stop thinking in single point solutions. A little bit to the picture on the left here. If you think of smart energy grids, it's about solar roofs on different buildings. It's about other renewable energy sources coming together, about smart meterings, all of these different compliances, all these different machinery, all these different applications, they need to come together in one way or the other. In a way, it's a system of systems. So on this point, it's whereas analog can typically work for you, you do need to have a digital perspective on this too, and you need to insert intelligence across all of these components in order to be effective. The same goes for smart mobility. There's a lot of smart mobility things we can do without being overly digital, don't get me wrong. But if we don't want to create yesterday's innovation, and if we want to be, if we are, as a group of stakeholders, if we want to believe that what eSmart produces is sufficiently future-proof, you also, on the mobility side, need to prepare for a system of systems where different data, different solutions come together in order to make that happen. So there's a number of things that a smart territory is not, with all the things that I said. It certainly never will be a one-size-fits-all end state, full of fancy digital solutions projected on a community top-down. And I know that from some of the early smart city proposals coming out of the early 2000s, some of the big tech companies coming up with these big PowerPoints, to us, that has been the idea, that impression was raised. But this is not what it should be, and certainly this is not what it should be for us. It's definitely also not a science fiction project requiring massive investments. It should also certainly not be, or not necessarily be, a tech-centric affair, which is just about technology. It's really about design, about coming together, about rules and conditions that will create the best way forward. So with that, better articulated than I just stated it. It is a series of design considerations and a converging of assets, of which many tend to already be present. I need to highlight it again. This is not necessarily always something that requires money. Applied in such a way that it generates a desired innovative impact of relevance to the present and future of the community. But it's also a framework of approaches, policies, partnerships, and platforms. When we think of a smart territory or a smart region, it's important to point out that we're not the first one to do this, that there are actually others that we can learn from. Smart Stavanger is one. We have got Greater Copenhagen that's actually doing a lot. These are some of the examples that I happen to be aware of, and there's countless of others. Here's another from Flanders in Belgium, and what they did is bring together 13 municipalities across the Flanders region, quite simply because each of those municipalities did not have the know-how or resources to actually go at this alone, and they needed the collaboration, which did not mean that 13 municipalities were all going to run the exact same thing or procure the same solutions, but they did arrive at a shared framework, resulting in reference architectures, a book, if you will, of curated interoperable solutions. So, as an example, as a region, they agreed that they wanted to have a particular type of smart parking solution, but that also meant that they wanted to find out which smart parking vendor would actually be compliant with their needs in terms of interoperability, in terms of the particular KPIs. And so what they did is list the vendors that were, let's say, in line with the conditions set by the region. They agreed to have an open data platform and shared living lab. So you see, many of the components, what eSmart is doing and is aiming to do, were already being done also here in Belgium. So that's a very good thing. But you can also see where they stopped short of defining what must be procured or what must be built right down to the last letter, but it did set the framework for what needed to be done in order to be effective. What I already introduced as part of the paper that I helped produce for eSmart around the smart territory roadmap and framework. I introduced this particular set of 20 building blocks. I articulated, in essence, this particular framework before as part of a book that I wrote, but I amended it to smart territory thinking. And I don't have the time to go in each and every of these building blocks. So rest assured, I'm not going to do that. But there are a number of things that I wanted to point out. First of all, in order to be effective with a smart community strategy of whatever kind, whether it's for a city or a territory or a province or in fact an entire nation, you need to be comprehensive. There's a lot of boxes to be checked, and these 20 building blocks talks to those, to that comprehensiveness, to the attempt of being complete. The joke I always make is this: even if you do all of this, is there's no guarantee of being successful. If you want to cook a great risotto, then you first of all need to get all the right ingredients on the kitchen table. Having all the right ingredients on the table does not guarantee you a great risotto. In fact, there's hundreds of ways of destroying that risotto with the perfect ingredients. But this is the start. These are the 20 ingredients that you at least need. And that's another important point. It does not, again, and I need to stress this again, it does not start out with technology. It does start out with a number of foundational concerns over leadership. Getting this right requires a right type of leadership. If you innovate, it can blow up in your face, and leadership needs to be ready for that. They need to invest in something that may or may not work. What I also find very important for any smart community initiative is that there are elected or perhaps non-elected, but at least sponsoring leaders, people that sponsor the project, that say, I stand behind this, I support this all the way. And I don't know, and it's actually a discussion that I want to have with you, and perhaps with Guido, perhaps you and I should get started on this. But can we identify some relevant names that can help sponsor the program, not just for the duration of eSmart itself, but also for the continuation and scaling of some of the innovations that eSmart is producing. So leadership is a very important one. Another one in this foundational set is governance. Governance is so very important because just look at all the pictures I just shared. Think of the cartoons, all the components that are happening in there. This is never about one city department or one municipal department. This is typically something that gets decided on and gets implemented on across many different departments. And then typically government does not do it alone. You need to collaborate. You need to have an ecosystem of partners around you. So all of this requires next generation governance within which you try to break up the silos, because the silos can be the biggest enemy of effective smart community development. So these are some of the components here on the foundational side. I will pick up on some of the technology components straight after this particular slide. There are many others. There are organizational components. What are your delivery models? What type of ecosystems are you working in? What combination of ecosystems and delivery models? What works best when you try to deliver on something? In some cases, also as part of eSmart down the road, especially if we start to scale solutions, do we need a full public-private partnership to deliver on some of this? When is it best for a municipality to do pre-commercial procurement in order to be able to play around with a new solution and see how open it is and how this works in your community within the confines and rules set by eSmart, for instance? So there are many, many questions on this organizational level, but also on the value side, this fourth quarter in this particular slide, there's a lot of things to be had. On the skills side, how prepared do you come? When it comes to data, integrity of data, how data can get hacked, how particular solutions get hacked, do you, within your organization that is responsible, are you convinced that you have the right skills to actually look at all of that and assess it? Some cases you may, in some cases you may not. And it's very important, first of all, to map what skills you have. And if you find that skills are lacking, what type of people do you need to to get into your organization? How do you train people that are already in on your team, but that need to get ready for this particular job? And Guido, again, perhaps this is something we can discuss, and we can actually build dedicated training programs if needed as part of eSmart, if there is appetite for that. So there's another care about, and we can address that later. But another one in terms of value is good design. Bad design results in digital divides. And with digital divides, I do not just mean catering for internet access for your grandmother or whatever. With good design, I mean a design that's inclusive, that is inclusive in terms of all of the territory citizens. That's not just something that's understood by the rich or the powerful or the few people that really enjoy digital, for instance. Good design makes sure that it's inclusive. And it's a major care about for our work. We can get it right from a policy planning perspective. We can get it right from a budgeting perspective. We can get it right from the collaboration across all of the e-smart countries and communities perspective, and still get it wrong because we got the wrong design, and we were not able to be fully inclusive in terms of interfaces, in terms of communications, bringing in citizens, getting their opinion in terms of what we do. I have given you the quickest readout on this model that is possible. I actually did a translation of this entire model in the paper that I submitted under eSmart per end of March. So every little ingredient here, every building block gets a bit of a translation as part of eSmart. So if you have not read the document, and have a look if you're interested, because it provides you with a little bit more insight than what I have right now time for to present. I did promise to focus a little bit on technology, not so much because I want to talk about technology, but because it provides me with the best illustrations as to why we need somewhat of a cross-vertical holistic approach when it comes to mobility and energy, and why many of the design principles that apply to smart communities and smart cities are therefore so relevant to eSmart. If you think of access technologies, most of our communities have much of it. We have fiber, we have fixed connectivity, we have Wi-Fi, we have obviously 4G, we will soon have 5G, and then there are many, many other wireless technology for very different types of use cases. What is important is, how do we apply the right technology that's often already in our backyard? How do we apply the right access technology for the right use case? I always use the example, if you have a sensor that for some reason is dug deep into the ground, then 4G will not make connection with that. It's not the right technology. But a very cheap, long range, low power energy like narrowband IoT or LoRa, and I will not confuse you with any further names if this is not your cup of tea, but very cheap wireless technologies, they actually do that job. So depending on your use case, you will need a different wireless technology. But you do need to consider that. You do need to see these technologies come together in order to make sure that you get the best connectivity for the right use case. Again, if you just think of that little cartoon with all of the mobility, and there's one here right underneath, I can share this. If you think of this cartoon here, and you think of all of these different components that at one point could get, and at one point will get connected, what is the best access technology in order to talk to all of these different devices? Again, and this is probably the third point I say it, if not more, perhaps the fourth or fifth time. Not necessarily does this require procurement. It requires a rethink in terms of what you already have, and perhaps there is a little bit extra that is required in order to be truly smart and future ready. But it is this overarching design set of design considerations and considerations around convergence, bringing the right stuff together in order to make all of this happen. To the point made per my introduction, and to the point that will be made by Rafael Guerrero from the city of Rome on data strategies for a city like Rome, but also for an entire region and also for much smaller communities, is you need a platform. You need a software layer, and you need to decide at one point whether you want it to be open source or whether you want to work with a particular software layer that gets created by a private sector entity with the ups and downsides to each choice. But these choices need to be made. And these are choices that eSmart, as a group of peers and communities, can and should be making. It should actually be looking at what are the various recommendations around this. What has the city of Rome done? What has another, perhaps the city of Grenoble or the city of Milan, or perhaps a much smaller community? What have they done in terms of these software layers? And can we agree on a number of principles that will apply to us as a smart territory? What type of analytics tools do we need? Do we need any type of artificial intelligence? By the way, another piece of terminology well overrated, but let's say just advanced calculation capabilities on a computer level in order to get some of the things done that you want to do across the board. And remember this, from my experience in working in multiple smart city projects, um, once you've got this is not just going to apply to smart energy grids and to mobility. It will apply to potentially many, many other use cases, whether it's smart waste or whether it's physical security, or because you're able to pick up on so many mobility patterns, are you able to see where the concentrations of people are? So in our COVID-19 world, and hopefully soon post-COVID-19 world, but with COVID-19 concerns and lessons learned, we want to be able to understand where do particular concentrations of people emerge and how can we actually mitigate that if needed. So these are some of the things that we're going to be able to do as a nice additional present. If we do our work well as part of eSmart, this is almost an automatic extra in terms of things that we can do at very, very little cost, but requiring a bit of insight and expertise in terms of how you actually do this. So I already shared this particular cartoon just now. One additional component, and I just want to touch on this complexity, where technology is not just about access, digital access, but about doing the right solutions and doing the right pieces of the architecture in the right place. Again, I'm not going to be long about it, but I do want to make sure that this particular component is understood. Think of the future, think of the intersection of 5 or 10 years from now. We have another Tesla coming in and it wants to talk directly to the traffic light, and there is a bus and it wants to talk to the bus stop that it's just about to arrive and it's just around the corner, for instance. Then some of the connectivity is perfectly run out of generic connectivity and analytics to be done out of a very remote data center. But imagine a car speeding towards an intersection, coming close to that traffic light. You don't want that signal to go all the way to a data center and then back, because by that time the car is already on the middle of the intersection. It's too late. So with that particular example in mind, what is needed is to build intelligence in a network hyper locally, right there where it's happening at a street cabinet level. Now, not every community may be ready for this, but this is definitely something that the city of Barcelona has done, and this is why I'm sharing this particular slide. They have created edge and fog computing capability. That means, intelligence at the edge of the network, hyper-local, like this example on the intersection. So this is where they actually built this across the city. This is not necessarily a very expensive thing to do, but they did this to be future ready in order to make sure that they could deal with the various mobility strategies that the city might want to embrace down the road. Let me move on beyond infrastructure and beyond intelligence in the network, because as I already pointed out, data strategies is probably going to be one of the most important things to have for eSmart to drive its long-term success. There are many components that we're going to need when it comes to data. Data is, again, one of those words that you can talk about for a very long time because there are many different types of data. But from a governmental perspective, there are various sources of data and various ways of data getting applied that you need to be mindful of. There is open data, data that's out there provided by government, sometimes also by private sector, and it can be used. It can drive innovation, and it's something that can typically be accessed also as part of eSmart because much of the data that we need can be publicly and openly available. And then that's a great thing. Most of the time, I have seen in working with municipalities that much of the data that's required for a smart mobility solution, for instance, already happens to sit within the municipality. Perhaps 80% of what you may need is already there. And so it really needs to, it really makes sense to have a good look at what is the data that you already have within your organization that we're going to need within an eSmart perspective at one point. Obviously, there is going to be external data with the forever major concern being out there that not every private sector entity is going to be willing to share their data because it carries value, they want to monetize it, and what have you not. But there is a lot of external data that is available and that can be used in order to optimize the solution that you have in mind. And then whether it's owned by private or public entities doesn't matter. There's a lot of data these days coming from Internet of Things devices, sensors, optical sensors, and what have you not. So all of these things come together, and typically you need to drive a convergence in order to have an effective data strategy. Now, to the point I already made, what is really important is that there is a lot of data that you already have that is probably going to be the most relevant data that you need. Probably, again, you already sit on 80% of the data that you already need, which is a great thing to think of. And very often, this is not about millions of sets of data. Very often, there is a fairly limited amount of sets of data that we actually need, and not only that you need, but actually many others need. When I think of smart cities, I've often found that there is this limited set amount of data around climate, around safety, around lighting, mobility, health and hygiene that gets reused for a different purpose. And that isn't just happening. That's not just true for governmental organizations, but it also happens to be true for private sector entities. So it's very important to be focused. What is that we actually need in terms of data? And with that, I want to drive this point home. There is a certain degree of madness out there in the smart city space with trying to drive as many open data initiatives as is possible. And to the right side of this particular slide, you can see me talking to this particular point. I've become very critical of some of the open data initiatives where cities will say, let's bring as much data together, create an open lake or a data lake or whatever. We bring all of the data together, and then we'll create a hackathon and some wonderful innovation will come out of it. And I've seen too many of these initiatives fail. What is important is actually to be very conservative around this and look at the old scientific tradition of statistics, of doing proper research, which is, what is the goal from an eSmart perspective? What is the purpose that you try to drive, that you try to deliver on? What data sets do you need in order to actually drive that purpose? So you need to build a data management model, but then also decide what data you actually need and then make it happen. And you may find it's not about all of that much data sets. And you may find that it's not actually about a very complex data management model. And that doing all of this is not actually very expensive. Actually, it may not involve a lot of cost at all. But again, this is about the process of decision making, about setting the terms, and about collectively as a group of stakeholders within eSmart deciding what it is that you do want to do, but also be clear about what you're not going to do. The Americans have a very nice saying for that, expression for it. Do not try to boil the ocean. There is no point. Let's not try to boil the ocean, but drive purpose, be concise about the data that we need, build the right models, and we are in better position to get the right outcomes that we need. Final point, I suppose, because I want to move towards a close. Procurement is another way where there is always the tight balance between what you do on a single stakeholder or a single municipality level and what you do holistic. And this is one of the major complexities for any smart region, and therefore also our smart territory, right? But there are models, there are people that have done this. And in fact, we have one expert with two cases, but he's going to talk about one, which is Rafael Guerrero. Before he went to Rome, he was the chief technology officer to the province of Brescia. And he set this smart procurement strategy up where there was the big picture, the major goals that wanted to be achieved, but every municipality was free to decide for themselves what they wanted to procure out of within that particular strategy. And if they decided to not do something today, they would still be free to re-engage later on and then still procure later on. But this was a very smart way of actually saying, we actually go further than just setting the terms. We are actually going to procure as a region, but we still leave the freedom intact for each and every individual municipality to make their own decisions. I personally like this example. I didn't just put it up forward because Rafael is going to speak today, but because it's actually within Europe, it's a very good example, and it's something that Rafael deserves a lot of credit for. I'm very happy and proud to have been given the time to present as part of our eSmart program. And this is one of the contributions of the Smart City Association Italy. We have contributed so far through the Smart Territory framework paper. And again, this is available, it's uploaded, you can read it. But obviously, we want to be able to contribute in the next stages and phases of eSmart. One of the things that we can happily do is help organize a series of webinars on smart territory related topics that talk to mobility and talk to smart grids, but are particularly, which do take the overarching smart territory perspective. Get experts in those webinars from which we can learn. So it's one thing that we can contribute to. Obviously, we want to help with the build out of the smart territory toolbox. And obviously, we also want to be a loyal and functional partner in the smart monitoring work. And with that, I pass the floor back to you, Christina.